Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. Especially if you want a clear look at developer Heart Machine's recent Steam release, Solar Ash, an action platform with a focus on exploration and some truly massive boss battles. Because I went through this title and completed it as thoroughly as possible so I could answer the question, was this title bound to be eclipsed, or was this slice of sci-fi a rising star in the scene? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. The Ultra Void, a supermassive black hole that has consumed so many other planets before, and yet not everyone is content to go quietly into the night. Instead, the Void Runners assembled, a small group of elites tasked with breaching beyond the Void's event horizon, bearing with them an ancient artifact known as the Star Seed, their planet's last hope at salvation. Only, it's all gone wrong. The team is dispersed, communication failed, and all record of the events leading to that moment have been lost, leaving the rookie, Ray, to try and salvage the seemingly suicidal mission. While the game lays out the premise simply enough in its intro, it doesn't waste time in hammering home just how bad the situation really is. For instance, while your hub NPC Sid can clarify some of the basics of the situation, she's in the dark almost as much as you are when it comes to the finer details, which starts out uncomfortable enough but gets even worse as you progress through the game and pursue all of the optional conversations with her. That sense of discomfort doesn't just end there either, since the Ultra Void's interior is, well, weird. A mind-bending patchwork formed from the remains of ravaged worlds stitched together in defiance of gravity. Whilst it's at times uncomfortable to see another planet drifting in pieces above you, it gets worse as you encounter the partially preserved slices, which serve as empty snapshots of these places largely populated by apocalyptic logs that you can find. It actually makes for a tasty bit of world building, and I frequently found myself pleasantly surprised by just how many seemingly innocuous spots had bits of lore stashed away in them, even in the most remote of locations, which helped motivate my explorations. That and just how funny some of these logs were. This tinge of adventurousness also led me to pursuing the character quests, and well, okay, quest might be a slight misnomer if you're hoping for a tangible reward. Rather, these are close to parallel journeys that others are undertaking in the midst of yours, but if you're a sucker for a good story, they certainly provide just that. Still, if you do follow all these narrative threads, you'll potentially encounter the same issue I did, namely Ray's obliviousness. See, while the plot of Solar Ash is in large part built on the mysteriousness of the situation, it doesn't take long for it to heavily hint towards key elements which are central to the plot, to the extent that I had essentially figured out how the game was going to culminate within the first 2 hours of the game. It's not subtle if you're the thorough sort, which actually makes it a bit frustrating when all of Ray's dialogue options simply gloss over the answers which are essentially sitting in front of her. Frankly, by the time I was seeing the mysterious entity that says hello after you beat each boss, I found myself applauding her decision to crush me into paste. If I had to talk to Ray, I'd be tempted to do that too. That's not to say I dislike her as a protagonist. I enjoyed hearing her thoughts as I skated about the world, but she's definitely dense as a brick. Friggin' rookie. It does explain why there's 2 endings though. Endings, which I should note, are not mutually exclusive incidentally, but they are carried forward by that possibility of obliviousness, that willful sticking of head in sand. Anyways, with my spiel about the story aside, let's get into the gameplay, and seriously, I wasn't trying to clickbait you with this video's title. The moment I got into the first bit of puzzle platforming as Ray, I started to get the, this feels familiar vibe. But once the big fuck-off boss fight showed up, I got so many warm fuzzies about the time I spent in Shadow of the Colossus that it was hard to quantify them. That said, this isn't a clone of that experience. There's some pretty notable differences. For one thing, there is a very large focus on agility and speed just baked into Ray's kit. Not only is her basic movement swift and smooth, she can grind off rails and surfaces like she was part of Jet Set Radio, she can dash and even long jump to clear some serious distance. Add in a contextual grappling hook and a time slow that not only helps you orient yourself, but boosts your grapple distance, and you have a solid set of abilities that serve as your mainstay throughout the game. In fact, I found myself repeatedly impressed by just how fun and flexible those abilities really were, to the point that I always felt empowered to explore an area to the fullest extent when I first got there, since I never found myself really needing to return back to an early area to unlock something. I had everything I needed. Plus, I would just frequently find myself skating about whichever recent ruin I'd been ransacking, just to get a feel for the landscape, collect the odd bubble or chunk of plasma, and investigate the bits of lore I bumped into. I think, actually, that was the crux of my time, with the biggest parts being hunting down the various void sigils, since they serve to indicate that a runner journal's nearby, and finding all of them in an area unlocks a neat suit, with abilities like better dashes, regenerating shields on kill, or doubling plasma gains. Also, bonus points for the void sigils actually hinting at the location of the log. That said, you will have to eventually tackle your actual objectives. See, in each area, there's a number of eyes scattered about, which you must purge in order to challenge the boss of the region, so you can then pass on to the next one. That said, there's some pretty distinct quirks to the process. In order to actually purify the eyes, Rei has to find a needle marker so she can properly attack it, which then promptly kicks off a bit of rapid-fire precision parkour. I say rapid-fire not because of some sort of stamina limitation or the like when climbing. Rather, a meter will start ticking up, which once full, will ignite all the goo in the area and kill you if you're touching it, forcing you to figure out and navigate an ideal path at a frantic pace. Precious seconds only bought by hitting the next marker in the path until you reach the actual eye. Whilst this is a bit tricky near the start to actually get the flow of it, the actual complexity of these segments gets a bit easier once you fall into the groove of things, and then promptly grows in complexity the further into the game you get as the scale of these segments grow and mix in environmental hazards, on-the-fly puzzles you need to complete during these segments, and even enemies attacking you as you're doing these. That said, the lengthiest ones you'll come across are in fact the boss fights themselves, who emerge onto the scene as your final hurdle in each area. Following much the same rules, you find yourself navigating a quick obstacle course trying to hit all the markers in order to burn through one of its stages, with each one growing more difficult as bits of the boss's carapace burns off from battle damage. That said, whilst these segments are tricky, they are fairly doable because should you find yourself pureed by a stray hit or cooked by time running out, you'll simply find yourself thrown back into the fray. The boss will still be on whatever phase you were working on, leaving you free to continue trying your hand at being the universe's most homicidal acupuncturist. At which point, well, you are finally given a reason to actually farm plasma, mostly because of these brief post-boss tete-a-tetes you have. See, early on in the game, you can spend a bunch of plasma to increase your max shield, and you would think it'd be done then, but no, at the end of these conversations, that smoosh that happens isn't just for show. It's so forceful it breaks one of your shield slots and reduces your max health until you spend the plasma again to repair it or boost yourself even further. And while you might be getting instantly popped when doing obstacle courses or fighting the bosses, health is actually far from useless since there's plenty of environmental hazards to trip up on, as well as combat encounters to fuss over. Admittedly, the combat does feel a bit limited, in large part because the actual bestiary isn't really all that diverse, with there only being more than a handful of critters to encounter, and their threat often being more tied to nearby environmental hazards than any sort of complex movesets. That said, it's also a matter of Rei's skillset being pretty basic on that front. She has a simple combo she can execute on the ground or in the air, with the largest bit of nuance derived from figuring out when to throw at a time slow to dish out a few extra hits, or maybe grapple away from an attack over to someone new to punch. Though, you can also weave in a dash occasionally to dodge or close the distance, but yeah, no. Essentially the combat's alright, but the most memorable experiences I had with it in Solar Ash were the ones that made really good use of the area and provided you obstacles and cover to weave between. But yeah, that's a lot of the gameplay, so let's just dig into the aesthetics here. And honestly, I have to say, Sorry that my computer's a bit of a potato, because what you're seeing doesn't fully do this game justice. I had to tone things down slightly for the recording, and that's a shame because this game is gorgeous. It is such a surreal experience to travel around and see the sights in the world, to the point that when I found myself stumbling onto an area that would provide me a more cinematic look at things, I would just sit there for a moment and take it all in, and I normally don't care to do that. I think that's another reason I actually regret that there weren't more enemies or bosses, because the designs are nice, a detail that also extends to Rei, since all of the various outfits that you find look different, providing an argument for solar fashion. It probably would work better in writing, but that was a horrible pun for you folks at home, I'm sorry. So yeah, while I was primarily wearing the outfits for their abilities, there were definitely times where I would just sort of putter around in a new one just because of how slick some of them looked. Really, the only quibble I actually have with the visuals is the fact that it can be a bit disorienting or motion sickness inducing when you find yourself rotating around a particularly gravity-defying segment. That, or how persnickety the camera can be when you're making super tight turns during a boss segment. And then we get to the audio half of things, and just, there is nothing I dislike on this front in this game. The voice acting is solid to the point that I didn't even have anything snarky to say about any of the characters. The overall sound effects were good to the point that the first time I picked out the crunch and the aftermath of Rei being smushed, I was a bit startled and squicked. But what really gets me is just how good the OST is. I don't think I found a single track I didn't like, and some of them just really stuck with me. The boss themes especially are fantastic, especially when you get to the final phase of each fight. Just, it is a chef kiss of a moment and just complements the situation and the story as a whole. In any case, I'm gonna stop gushing about this. It's about time to sum everything up, and the main point I really want to say here is I enjoyed this so much that I wish there'd been a little more of it. I did take around 10 hours to get to the game in total because of how thoroughly I was exploring each area, but I was really hoping for just another boss or two to fight, since I'd had so much fun with these segments, with all of the figuring out for how to actually summon them up and then actually engaging with them. They're just, the whole kit and caboodle was so good. The storytelling overall, I actually had a lot of fun with. I do think, again, the matter of Rei's obliviousness was a little bit annoying, but the effort put into the world building as a whole was delightful, especially with things like all of the side lore and how it all weaves together. And even after beating the game, there were still more things to do, like a hardcore mode that narrows all the timers for the boss and purification segments in case the game was too easy for you. Even with the bonus suit I gained for 100%ing everything, that gives you every suit's power at once, I was still side-eyeing that challenge. That said, it's just a fantastic experience, and one that has me so very excited for Heart Machine's next project, Hyperlight Breaker, if only because of the love and care the developers placed into this in Hyperlight Drifter. So it should come as absolutely no surprise to anyone that I ultimately warrant this game as a crit hit. It's just really good. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, even a game suggests that I should go and cover, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon, so you can support me and the other member of Crit Hit Hop. Also to my Twitch, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live and actually see this whole process. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.